okay? 3 people you don't know and just kind of sit together. You can't be with your spouse or team member. So sit in groups, sorry, I'm totally into marriage, but for this activity, find 3 strangers. You're going to form a group of 4, okay? So sit with someone you don't know. We're going to take a minute to let you get up. Again, this is the most uncomfortable part. Sit with 3 strangers, groups of 4. Find someone you don't know. Okay, you're in groups of 4, and you have one of these pamphlets, and you have something to write with, right? Everyone has one of the pamphlets, and you have a pen in hand. All right. Perfect. Well, why don't we go ahead and start with a word of prayer? All right. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to listen to one another, and most of all, we ask that you would give us ears to listen to you and give us a heart to receive what you would want to speak to us. We pray these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. My name is Lisa Marie Anderson de Umaña, and so it's a pleasure to be here with you guys, and I am here to kind of make the voices of Latin Americans heard. That's the name of the book where your material has been excerpted from, Latin American Voices on Leadership. As you look at the cover that you guys have, research-based findings means that it comes from the dissertation that I did a few years ago of interviewing Latin Americans, those pastors that were influential in Tegucigalpa. I did in-depth interviews and about how they emerged as leaders. How did they grow as leaders? Tell me your story. And so I looked at the patterns that came kind of across the board from these interviews and decided to discern the ways that God was already at work in their lives. These are established leaders, referenced, peer review people, influential. But I was curious as to how they became leaders. And so what we have is you'll have some stories that we'll go through today, but we're also, because of my strong belief in brain-based education, I'm an educator, the more active you are, engaged, and so you learn more. And so that's why there's be some questions. That's the kind of the format, either in a group or just by yourself, some questions that I'm going to be asking you to reflect on. And so what John said today about us being co-participants with the Lord, that he gives us the privilege of being, the ministry of reconciliation. We have the privilege. That is the focus of this, that we are co-participants with God in helping others emerge as leaders. I would define leaders as someone who wields influence. So we're not going to get all falutin and high academics and all these definitions. In some sphere of life, all of us wield some sort of an influence, whether it's families and moms with our kids or, heads of ministry. And so we're also working with others who may be leaders yet to be discovered. And there's probably some fear in your ministry where you want to work with people and also have them wield influence. So that's what we mean in my case when we're talking about leadership, okay? So, it all started when I was observing in our ministry, Christian Camping International, that some people would come to the meetings year after year. We work in Christian camping from Mexico to Argentina, and I would see them sitting at the table where we gathered from about 10 or 12 different countries, and some would be like with new leaders every year. I was like, hey, mira, so-and-so's, from Guatemala has new leaders, or from Peru or something. And then some leaders, year after year, they would have no leaders with them. And I was like, why is that? Why do some leaders form leaders, but others don't? I just was curious as to what was going on. Is it like temperament, or, some are too busy, or what's going on? And so that's what prompted this in-depth study, that you will be discovering what the research has showed. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from. That was my curiosity of what was going on. So, my first question was actually when I would interview, and then when I would subsequently use surveys in a number of other countries in South America, was tell me the story of how you became a leader. Man, they were like 90-minute interviews. And like the first half an hour was them telling me their stories. Fascinating stories. But I want to engage you in this, and I want you to answer that question. If you open the first page, you'll see a map. And how did you first emerge as a leader? Complete the map by answering the questions about your emergence as a leader in as much detail as possible. My story is very simple. I was 16. I was on a retreat with our youth group in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I'm from. And we were doing, this is like quite a few years ago, we were doing one of those simulation games where like, okay, you're on a lifeboat, and there's 6 people there, and you have to get rid of 2 because only 4 people fit on the boat. And, we're like 16, we're all getting into it, who's going to drowned, toss him off the boat. And the group turned to me, and I was like, oh, I'll drown, cast me off. This was before Survivor existed, so there was no vote. And they're like, no, we can't let you off the boat. And I'm like, why? They're like, because you're a leader. I remember going, I had never thought of myself in those terms. And that was the first time someone named that in me. And I remember, wow, that's interesting. So I kind of looked at myself a little differently after that experience. Brief. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes for you just to be like, okay, what happened? Who was invited? Where were you? Who was involved? Perdón. When did this happen? Tell it like a story. So just kind of look at that jigsaw puzzle format. Take a couple minutes of silence to answer and fill in your map. Okay, 1 minute left. All right. Okay, I know you're probably could keep writing a lot, but we are going to ask you to make a summary in your group of 4, okay? So you guys are kind of gather around, you're going to circle up a little bit, and you're just going to take 2 minutes to kind of give them your brief summary. If this was Latin Americans, it would take 10 minutes for them to share their story. But because we believe in the economy of words, we're going to be doing a little summary. And so 2 minutes each. I'm going to kind of mark the 2 minutes, and so you're just going to tell them how you emerged as a leader. All righty? Go for it. Start from the oldest to the youngest. Oh, the words of wisdom. You will reveal your age. Okay, first one, 2 minutes are running.
Steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace. To this I owe my
Okay, hopefully all 4 people have shared. Is that correct? Thumbs up? Okay, here's what I want you to do. Okay, I want you to just pause in your mind and say to yourself, okay, what are the patterns that I just noticed? Okay, so first do it just by yourself. Say, okay, all 4 of us shared. Was there any common thread that we all mentioned? Okay, take a minute, write it down at the bottom of your map and say, perhaps this was a common thread or that was a common thread. Take a minute just by yourself to observe and draw some patterns. Okay, if you have a pattern or so, go ahead and comment in it in your group and listen to one another and to hear what they've observed, okay? I'm going to give you another 3 minutes to make your comments in your group. All right. Given the brevity of amount of time that we gave you to write your story and then how brief it was to tell the story, there might, obviously, the richness of the patterns that you discover require time. I had usually 90 minutes or more with each of the people that I was interviewing. And then I spent a lot of times reviewing their transcripts. And there was a coding process by which I could do word searches and I could look at commonalities. The number one process that came from the research showed that accompaniment, having been acompañado, that was the verb that was used, was the number one pattern that every single person mentioned. When I say acompañado, you can jot down some of the thoughts on the next page. It says acompañamiento, the top process mentioned in all the in-depth interviews. And what that looks like is that someone took an interest in them. Someone walked alongside of them. They noticed, and they oftentimes named some strength, some quality, something that they saw that was valuable. Oftentimes the leaders would describe it almost a discipleship process that would go on, but not like the formal, the Bible study type thing, but a discipleship that formed their relationship with Christ. It almost always involved some ministry or some activity that they were involved in. And it was sort of this coachable teaching moment that eventually that process helped them emerge. It usually was in their late teen years that this happened, and oftentimes it stretched over long periods of time. It wasn't like a one-shot deal, the accompaniment. One guy said his experience came from, it started out that he was invited with a bunch of missionaries to go herd the donkeys and the burros, because the missionaries were headed into the boonies, the rural areas, and he was called at 16 and said, you work good with donkeys. You're doing a great job. Come with us. And that was the thing that he remembered, an activity that he was called to, and he was accompanied for a number of years. The results of the investment were not always immediately visible. Sometimes it took time, but the result was a huge harvest. The men and women that I interviewed are very influential. Not that they all have big churches, but they were very influential leaders, and all of them could name, nombre y apellido of who that person was. It wasn't anything nebulous. It was so-and-so accompanied me, and they knew exactly who that person was. It was highly relational. Usually the person was older, and they kind of practiced life and ministry together. Like he or she would go and watch them when they played soccer, or they would invite them into their home. And given the diffuse nature in Latin America, where personal life and work life and ministry is kind of all merged together, they don't compartmentalize which North Americans and North Atlantic people tend to do. So they'd be in their house, they'd been invited, kind of feel part of the family. It wasn't like, no, this is at work, we meet at work, and all the lines were very clearly drawn. This is a diffuse culture. So there's a story that I love to tell. And his name, his pseudonym is Mateo. And I want you to listen to the story. Mateo and his wife began a church in Tegucigalpa in the 70s. He describes how one day 3 hippies arrived at their house. 70s, right? They're talking peace and love and smoking marijuana. And he says, I would accompany them. We'd walk around the streets, play guitar and singing the hippie-like music protest. Until little by little, I became their friend. One day, they invited me to a campfire. Yay, camp. And they asked me to talk to them about Jesus. And I started telling them about the love of the Lord. And they started right then and there to receive the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And crying, and they became Christians. I took under my wing 10 of them, he says. And we started an intensive discipleship course. Pretty soon, we needed a bigger place to meet, and we bought a piece of land. We put up a tent, And within 2 years, we had 300 young people attending them. Most of them were drug addicts. An entire movement started with social works like medical clinics, a place for kids to get a meal a day. And when Hurricane Fifi hit in the 74, they went out to rescue people. And God is, to this day, continues to do marvelous things. The problem with drug addiction was so great that we didn't have a place to fit them. And so we bought a farm. And for the last 30 years, this is one of the most famous places for rehab in Latin America, in Honduras. And that was the beginning of it. And so, I don't know if you know Mario Fumero, Ciudad Victoria, is that the name of it? Centro Victoria. And so his story was about how he accompanied others. And he had a whole story about how he was accompanied. And he was accompanied when he was in Cuba. He's like older now. He was part of the whole Cuban Revolution and everything. So his story was, I was accompanied and I accompanied other people. So some people, when I've talked in academia with this and shared the results, they're aware of in educational world, there's called formal education, which is like seminaries and Bible institutes. You get a degree. School is a formal domain for education. The one that's more common to missionaries is like non-formal, like training courses and workshops, and not necessarily part of this whole certificate, sort of process. But the third domain is called informal. And informal education is actually by imitation. It's actually like what you pick up at home, or it's how you learn things, but it's almost just by imitation. So those three domains of the processes that I discovered of how people emerge, all the processes are within the informal domain. Now, okay, my job title is Director of Leadership Development and Training. So when people, no one that I interviewed said they became a leader from a training course, I was like, dang, that's like my job. And it was the most surprising discovery, because I was like, so what does that mean? If no one could cite any course, no one mentioned it. Sometimes I wanted to say, wasn't there a training course that was pivotal in your emergence? And that would have ruined the whole, unbiased point of view. And I remember thinking, that has to say something. That the way people emerge, and I've heard several of the groups I heard, when they talked about how they emerged, it was in an informal setting. And we can tend to pin our hopes as missionaries in saying, I have this leadership development course. Well, if someone interviews them a few years from now, they might not say that it was your course that helped them. It was the fact that someone accompanied them. So let's just drill down a second and say, well, if that's one of the processes that the Lord uses, I'm on page 3 here. It says, personal reflection exercises, advancing through accompaniment, starting with prayer, okay? I would like you to take a minute and read through these prayers. They're just 5 kind of inserts, and underline the one that might be most relevant to you. It might hit at the core for you. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes to read through and to mark up one that you can identify with. Which item seemed to kind of touch the most? Was there somebody that can just raise their hand and say, hey, number such and such seems to kind of resonate with me? Yes. Excellent, given the situation of being an active mama. Excellent, thank you. Anyone else have one that particularly hits home? Yes. Okay. Excellent point. And that's one of the problems. We tend to have an elitist view, like, oh, whoa, leader. And then in a culture that's very high power distance, where you have a lot of status, if you're in a ministry, it tends to be like, no, I'm not one of them. And that's why we're talking about influencing someone. Mm-hmm. The comfort zone, definitely, I think Honduras does a good job. Probably the Lord uses that to push us out of our comfort zone in another country. Excellent. One more person. Yes. Stand up so I can hear you. We can hear you. Excellent, excellent point. And that's the next page actually mentions this. And there's a picture here in the figure 11. It says, write down the names of some of the people with whom you work who could be considered potential leaders. Okay, let me just mention one of the prayers it was the number 2. It said, open my eyes to notice any leadership indicators. As you're thinking about, well, Lord, who's around that you might want me to accompany? The 3 things that I would say when they would be like, no, this guy, this leader or this friend, he started to hang out with me, and I would say to them, why do you think they started to accompany you? And at first it was like, I don't know, they just did. I said, but what did they see in you? And one guy said, I think he mentioned something that when I put the chairs in order, I aligned them really well. Another one said, I think he saw in me that this is an awesome story. This is a pastor. I'm going to take a minute to just say a story. He's 15. He walks out on the street in Comayagua, and he was so depressed, he went to the bridge. He says, I'm going to just kill myself. So he goes over the bridge, and he looks over, and he's like, oh, shoot, there's not enough water to carry my body, in the stream. So I'm going to come back later, and maybe there'll be more water. So he starts wandering down the streets, and he hears a church that's singing like choruses. And he's like, oh, I remember my grandma. He grew up in Progreso. My grandma used to sing these choruses to me. So he stands across the street, and he's there, and this little old lady comes out and says, Mira, ven, come on in. And so he's like, okay, but I'm just going to sit in the back. So he sits in the back. Dude, the guy's preaching, and he says, he's talking to me. Who told him my story? That Friday night, he gets converted. Boom, right there, becomes a Christian. Saturday morning, the pastor finds him, and he's in the church with a few old T-shirts cleaning the benches. And the pastor says, so, Carlos, glad to see you. I recognize you from last night. What are you doing here? He said, this is God's house. And it shouldn't be this dirty. This is a bus route. And so I'm here because I'm just cleaning up the benches and dusting things off because that's the way the Lord wants. some, order and cleanliness. And he tells that story, and I was like, sense of excellence, initiative, responsibility. The sweetest thing is 15 years later, this pastor succeeds and he becomes the next lead pastor. I mean, amazing. And the first pastor was actually a missionary. Amazing how many people named missionaries as the people that, that were accompanying them. So as you look at the list, you're like, okay, who do I see who has some signs of initiative? Who do I see that there's a certain sense of excellence and responsibility? They fulfill their word. So again, this is like, you don't have to sign it in blood or anything, but this is kind of your first things that maybe I could, I feel the Lord prompting me so-and-so. So take a minute, just jot down some names. Okay, we're going to raise it up a notch and see if there's some sort of confirmation with the names that you wrote down. And so I'm going to ask you to go into your ministry teams. If you're just here with your spouse, that's fine too. But if there's someone else from your ministry as well, so go back and sit with someone with whom you minister and share some of the names to see what they might think. Hey, sounds like a good idea. If you're here alone, God might just, give you confirmation. So go ahead and sit with whoever it is that you came with and share the names and see if you can nail it down to one. make sure that everyone has had a chance to share. Obviously, if there's two of you, it's probably easier. All right. I'm going to ask you to look at page 5 of your handout. And page 5 says something that kind of interesting. It says a personal reflection exercise is identifying potential leaders. It says take a minute to discern how God may already be working in the lives of the people that you identified as leaders yet to be discovered. Remember the leaders who form leaders. Notice where God is already at work. And they look for ways to serve as co-participants, harking back to what John was talking about, that God doesn't need us to help leaders emerge. He does quite well without us. Latin America is evidence that there's a ton of leaders with the new churches that have been springing up for the last 30, 40 years. And there are leaders that God's raised up. So as missionaries here, we want to look where he's already at work. So can you write the name beside write your name beside the taller figure in the silhouette, and choose maybe one person in whom you see that God is already at work and whom you would consider accompanying, and write his or her first name beside the other figure. Now, a question that can put your feet on the ground is the last question that says, what might be one barrier to your obedience to what God has indicated that you should do? If the Lord's confirming that you can intentionally move towards this person, what might be one barrier that right away pops up? It might be something as simple as, I don't know Spanish that much, or I don't know if they're going to say no, or again, this isn't a mentor. The word was never mentioned. They never said mentor. They always said alguien que me acompañó. So it's not a mechanistic process. It's not like a 12-step. This is, again, it's a very natural, looks more like a friendship sort of components, relational. So, but in your mind, what might be the first thing is like, you might say, I don't know, I don't have any time. I'm too busy in ministry, or I'm, got too many other irons in the fire. So what is immediately something you're like, okay, this is the first kind of barrier that jumps out at me? And take a minute to just comment with someone there in your group to say, Lord, I'm gonna need some help with this here. Help me out. How can I overcome this? I know that this merits more discussion than I'm giving you time for right now, but I want to remind you of my original question when I moved into the investigation was, why do some people form leaders and others don't. And as I delved into the research and the writings, ample writings about leadership in Latin America, one of the things that came out wasn't just the temperament, how busy they were, it was the culture. So a third component, emergence, growth, and the third component was, how does the Latin American culture influence the processes of how leaders emerge and how they grow? What does Latin America have that's distinctive that I should understand? So I invited a resident expert. He's a resident because we live together. He's my husband, so it's okay. It's the code of conduct here. And so I have him to kind of bring us his cultural perspective as a Honduran. So I'm going to let him move to the next. Oh, yes. Give him a hand. Give him a hand.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, as a Honduran, the first thing I want to say is thank you for being in Honduras. It's a privilege to be with you and to enjoy fellowship definitely these few days. So thank you for having us here. As Lisa was mentioning, one of the things that came out of the investigation, the research, was the fact that culture influences leadership. Leadership happens in a context, and leadership development happens in a context. It happens that this is, I guess, one of the few research studies on leadership that is in another context different to the North American context. So let's travel to how leadership is seen here in this part of the world. What you're going to find in the book is that it connects with each one of the processes of emerging or growing as a leader. There is a cultural aspect that greatly influences that process. The process that Lisa has been talking about right now is acompañamiento. So I want to tell you a couple of stories about a cultural aspect that you and I will have to take into account, you will have to take into account when you are accompanying here in this context. I work as an organizational development expert here in Honduras, and that takes me to different organizations. Many years ago, an organization invited me to be a consultant for them, and the problem they were having was described by the leader of that organization to me, and she said, it was a woman, she said, you know what, I tell them that they should decide what to do, and they don't decide what to do. And when I send them to do something, they are all the time asking me, how do I do it? Tell me what you want me to do and I will do it. And I don't want to tell them what they want to do. I want them to decide what they want to do and do it. And so I don't know how to do this. Can you teach them? That was the request for me. Can you teach them to do the things by themselves instead of asking me? Now, this was a girl from Denmark. She was working here with Hondurans. And so I was surprised by the request. I started to study the case and I said, you know what? You really have to tell them what to do sometimes. And she was, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be this authoritarian kind of boss. I don't want to tell them what to do. I want them to decide what to do. And so we started to work with Hondurans to take more initiative with her, to be able to tell them more directly. And we were working, but changes didn't happen that well. And at the end, they stay, she left. Now, this was a very, very capable woman. I admire this leader. But the cultural aspect that she didn't get a grasp of it is what I want to bring to you today. It's called caudillismo. It's a word in Spanish that doesn't have a complete good translation in English. You don't have a word that explains caudillismo. Caudillismo is a prototype of a leader. There are different prototypes of leaders. One of them is caudillismo, and that's the one that I would say dominates Latin America. So caudillismo is this prototype of leadership that is hierarchical, and is authoritative, and tells people what to do, and they do it. Well, guess what? It's not just that the leaders are used to tell the people what to do and they did do it. It's that we, and I'm going to say we because I'm a Honduran, we are willing to do what the leader says to do without asking, without initiative necessarily. We feel good in that environment. Somebody tells me what to do, and I am a good steward of what he tell me or she tell me, and I'll do it. So that's the water we swim in. Now, being married with an American, I have become kind of American. And I discovered that culturally sometimes. And I just discovered again a little bit ago. I was called to another engagement in my business, and the person I found leading the project was a typical caudillo. I didn't like it. I didn't want to work with him, but guess what? He was my customer. And if I opposed him, my influence in the project was going to be diminished. The purpose of the project was going to be obstacled. It won't work. So I had to accept that even though my preference is not to work with a caudillo, I needed the caudillo in order for the project to go on. So humbly, when he asked me to repeat what I already told him, and he said, but tell me again, I'll tell him again. Because I had to overcome my resistance to it in order to do the accompanying that I was asked to do. Because that's what I was hired to. It was to accompany. So sometimes the caudillismo actually helps the development of leadership, and sometimes the caudillismo hinders the development of leadership. Let me give you a little bit of, and that's probably, those are the questions that I think you have in your pamphlet there. Is what is in the page 6. At the end of the page, it says, how does caudillismo help accompaniment and how does hinder accompaniment? Well, let me give you some ideas of this. Some ways in which caudillismo helps is the way that caudillismo and the ones following the caudillismo understand submission and understand authority. That helps the development of leaders in certain ways, because I'm willing to learn, I'm willing to listen, I'm willing to obey. When I am willing to obey, I am learning leadership. So in that sense, caudillismo can be of help for the growth or for the emergence of leadership. The other way is there is a paternalistic aspect of caudillismo. It's like, you work with me, but I take care of you. And in taking care of you, I accompany you. So in certain way, that helps, because it's like I'm working with the caudillo, I do what he says, but at the same time I'm being accompanied and I'm learning from him or from her in the way. The collectivistic aspect of caudillismo is also interesting, because that family sense that Lisa mentions, in which it becomes diffused, but it's family, but it's loyalty, it's a lot of strong ties in this prototype of leadership in which the caudillo and the person working with him or her actually get together in a very collectivistic way. All those things actually help the emergence and the growth of leadership. Now, there are also shadow sides to this caudillo reality. For example, leadership can be really very personalistic, in which the caudillo can become really stingy with his or her gifts. It's mine, and I am afraid that if I give you more, you're going to take my place, and so I don't want you to grow. That could happen also under this prototype, and that hindrance leadership. And the other thing is that the power is negotiated. That means that sometimes I will give you power, and sometimes I can take the power according to how you are behaving. And in that sense, when the caudillo acts in this way, it hindrances and actually kind of push back any leadership, because he or she is negotiating power. Now, sometimes you have to go into the negotiating power situation, because if you are in good terms with the leader, with the caudillo, you get you get people to do what you need to do. And if you are not in good terms with the leader or the caudillo, he can stop everything you are doing. So, as missionaries, knowing how to handle this cultural aspect will help you to accompanying. And we were discussing with Lisa this morning that sometimes in culture you have to surf the waves instead of coming as a destructor in the sea. And that means that sometimes, as I did in this last engagement, you have to humble and you have to accept that level of authority, and you have to go with it if you really want to do the ministry that the Lord told you to do. As far as you are not sinning, you do have to take into account culture, and not always you have to go kind of confront it. Sometimes you have to just go with it. And that's sometimes not easy when you are coming from another context. So, as I am relating caudillismo with accompanying, you're going to find that there are other elements of the culture that affect the way you accompany people. And there is always a tie between culture and the processes that the Lord is using to raise leaders in this context, which is not always the same way that he raises leaders in other contexts. But there is no wrong and right. We are just in Honduras, and we have to learn about these Hondurans. And I'm glad that you're learning about me here. So blessings. I appreciate your presence here, and we are here to serve you. Blessings to all of you.
Thank you very much, guys. Well, did you learn something? Are you going to remember what you learned? That's why you wrote it down, right? Buy the book, don't forget. All right, so we are going to go ahead and break for lunch at this time. If you see on your back of your name tags, you have a copy of the schedule. We have an almost 2-hour break for lunch. Part of the reason we do that is because it's going to take a while to feed all of you, and also to give you some time to hang out, to fellowship. We would encourage you to stay Even if you live nearby, I know that there are some of you who might need to go run an errand or do something during this break. But if you do not need to leave, I would encourage you to stay here, to be with people, to take advantage of this time of fellowship. And not to miss out on that. We love this time where we learn together, but we also love the time when we just get to hang out together and be with each other, catch up, meet somebody new. And so we want to encourage you to take advantage of this time slot that you are given. However, we do know it's really hot outside. So once you have finished eating, if you would like to return into the sanctuary to fellowship, you can do that. You can bring your kids in here as well. We are going to ask you, though, to be kind of aware as you do come in, because there are some people who are going to be having some of those prayer appointments and counseling appointments, and they will be here in the sanctuary, probably over kind of at this side of the sanctuary, just to kind of let us still hang out over there. But if you do see some people praying, or you do see some people kind of having that kind of like one-on-one time with somebody, just be respectful of that and kind of take you and your kids over to the other side of the sanctuary or go back outside. So we do want to remind you about those appointments. If you have one at the 1 o'clock time slot, please try and eat quickly so that you can meet with the person that you're scheduled with, and you're going to meet at the registration area. If you have kids, bring your kids with you at that time, and then one of our staff will come and meet you as well to be able to hang out with your kids during that prayer time. Let me give you some instructions of how lunch is going to be served so that do you have something you need to say? Okay. So please bring your pamphlets back with you so that tomorrow you can continue and finish out the lesson. So bring those back. We're going to trust that you remember them. If you need to elbow your spouse or your forgetful friend or send them a text message, don't forget your stuff. Make sure you do that. So as we dismiss from here, if you have children with you, if you have teenagers, they're being dismissed, the youth group, they're being dismissed on their own. They've already been given instructions about lunch. However, it is your responsibility to know where they are during these 2 hours of free time. So we are going to ask that you don't leave them here. Like if you have to run an errand or something and you have some children, please don't just leave them. Please know where they are. They are not required to sit with you, nor are your smaller children. They don't have to sit with you at lunch, but you do need to know where they are and what they're doing. And of course, we want to take into account that this is not our house, and so we want to honor the house and honor the property. So if you see a child that's not yours that maybe is doing something that they shouldn't do, lovingly, gently ask them to find their parent. We also just want to make sure that we are leaving the place very nice and clean. So we are going to ask that you take care of your trash. If you see trash around on the floor, on a table, wherever it is, please pick it up, put it in a trash can. Help us to make sure that we are leaving this place in a great condition. So as we leave from here, if you have kids that need to be signed out, you can go ahead and sign them out. And then what we're going to ask you to do, everybody's listening, right? Okay. Are you sure? Yeah, because I always say things and people are like, what's happening? I don't know what's going on. So you're going to go around to the back of the tent. There is a cooler sitting on the floor with ice and cold drinks. You're going to take one. Your kid is going to take one. And you're going to go find a seat. And you're going to sit down. And our staff is going to bring a meal to you. There's not a lot of room under that tent for making long lines, as we noticed at the coffee break. So you're going to sit, and we will bring food to you. If you have a child that is 11 and under, they get a kid's meal. 12 and up, everybody gets the same meal. So if you have an 11 and under, when the servers come around, please let them know that you get a kid's meal. If you are gluten, dairy free, we have a couple of those meals as well, so please let the server know that you get one of the gluten, dairy-free plates instead of the regular plates. So just let our staff know so that they can make sure to bring enough and bring the right things to you. If you don't fit, because there are only 130 chairs under there, and we are more than that, If you don't fit, we have an overflow room. So fill under the tent first, and if you see that there's not enough space for you and your family, we have an overflow in the youth room. So if you don't have a teenager and you don't know where that is around the back side of the church onto the paved part of the parking lot, and there's a door that says youth, and they have already set up tables and chairs for you. They may already have claimed them, and they may just choose to sit there themselves, but we have room for about 30, 40 extra people in that room as well. If you see that there's no room in the tent, get your drink and go out to the youth room, and again, somebody will bring meals to you. So you don't have to worry about getting your meal first and then heading over there. We're also going to ask that if you see anybody with a red lanyard that's not serving, because some of them will be serving, but if you see anybody with a red lanyard that's not serving, or anybody that's our guest speakers, or Lisa and her husband, anybody like that, if you could make sure that they get served before you. So let them come and get in line, find their seat, because they need to be ready before you do. So that way they can be back in the kids' room, ready to receive your kids before 2 o'clock, so that you can be in here at 2 o'clock. So when you check your kids back in, they will be ready 15 minutes ahead of the time that we're starting to receive your kids to be able to sign in for the afternoon session. Does anyone have any questions? Is it clear as mud? Okay, pick up kids, get your drink, sit down, let the staff go first. Got it? All right, let's pray over our meal. God, we thank you for this morning. We thank you for all that you are doing, that you're teaching us, that you're instructing us, that you're reminding us of. Thank you for this beautiful time of fellowship that is to come. Thank you for the connections that will happen in this place, for the friendships that will develop, and the strategic relationships that you have already ordained for us to establish and grow in during this time. We thank you for the food that you provided. Thank you for Power Chicken that donated the food to us. Thank you for the blessing of this house and the space for us to be able to use during this time of fellowship. We praise you for it. Keep us all safe and healthy, and help us to have a great afternoon. In Jesus' name, amen. You are dismissed.